Why, hello there, friends. It's Emma here, the Bookish Princess. It's that time of the year, time for my bookish wrap-up video. I've made a list of my 19 favorite books that I read this year. Let's get started. It's always fun each year putting together this list, looking back on all the books that I've read. I go and rewatch some of my old bookish reading vlogs to kind of refresh my memory and think about, well, which books really stuck with me, which had lines and scenes that, continued to pop up in my mind long after I had read them. I really enjoyed all of these books, so I don't really know where to start. I didn't put them in any particular order. The number of books that I read were library or Kindle books, so I'll make sure I put the book up on the screen here, and I'll leave all of these linked down in the description below if you want to check them out. Jane was beginning to fence herself against Aunt Irene by a sturdy little philosophy of her own. Aunt Irene felt it, though she couldn't put it into words. If she could have, she would have said that Jane looked at her and then, quietly and politely, shut some door of her soul in her face. I read Jane of Lantern Hill by Ella Montgomery this year. This was my first time reading this. Jane is a little bit of a different heroine from some of Ella Montgomery's other heroines like Anne of Green Gables and Emily of New Moon, but I just love Jane, like in the quote. I love how we see her kind of grow, and she's really independent. She starts out independent, but even from that she learns to grow and kind of be her own person, and like the quote says, to shut the door of her soul in the face of people who just will never understand her. There are lots of difficult, unpleasant people in Ella Montgomery. You get the feeling that Ella Montgomery herself, I think, had to deal with plenty of unpleasant people, but she wrote such beautiful, beautiful books. She managed to create such happy, wonderful worlds. Jane starts out in a very unhappy environment, but then she ends up traveling to Prince Edward Island. There's a little bit of a mystery, of her past, that she ends up discovering. So many charming, funny vignettes. This is the Virago Modern Classics edition, which actually, I don't know if you can see on the top shelf there. This year I did treat myself to a bunch of the Ella Montgomery Virago Modern Classics because they have such beautiful covers. You can kind of see the covers of the Emily of New Moon there on the back. On the morning following his old friend's arrival, Lord Ickenham had settled himself in his hammock when a husky voice spoke his name, and he found Mr. Schoonmaker at his side. And there was in his bearing no suggestion whatsoever that he was the happiest man on earth. He looked, indeed, far more like the schooner Hesperus, of which Lord Ickenham in his boyhood had recited so successfully on the occasion when it swept like a sheeted ghost to the reef of Norman's Woe. I read Service with a Smile by P.G. Wodehouse this year. Lord Ickenham, the main character, gets interrupted in his hammock quite a bit. He's just trying to get some rest, although he doesn't rest all the time. He also tries to spread sweetness and light, and sometimes it backfires. Reading this has made me realize I want to read more Lord Ickenham stories, because I know P.G. Wodehouse wrote a couple more. Another thing I love about P.G. Wodehouse, as we saw in that quote, is the way he just casually drops allusions to these classical poems and works of literature. P.G. Wodehouse is just such an absolute delight. If you ever need a sort of mood lifter to just give you an escape, Wodehouse is the way to go. What right had Tom Byrne to discern within a month of their meeting that Susie had a heart of gold, a sterling sense of humor, and the kind of creative common sense that can smooth out personal crises in a moment? So Susie was the light of their life, the joy of their declining years. But what business was that of Tom Byrne's? I read The Secret Countess by Eva Ibbotson this year. It was such a delightful story. So many fabulous characters. Susie and Tom Byrne aren't even the main characters, but their romance is really sweet, and there are some other romances woven into the book. This is actually about a Russian family, very well-to-do, left the country during the Revolution and came to live in England, but of course had to really start from the bottom because they didn't have any of their wealth to bring with them. But the main character, Anna, is so sweet. She was raised in extreme luxury, but it didn't go to her head at all. Now in England, she's enjoying working as a maid. She just finds so much joy in everything around her, whatever her circumstances might be. It was just such a fabulous book, some really good writing, some really interesting plot twists and turns, some really hilarious, fabulous scenes. The morning sea has on the mountaintops kindled her glowing beacon. When Uri calls, when Unterwald replies, Schweitz will be mindful of her ancient league. Obviously, I had to read some Swiss classics since we were traveling in Switzerland. I read William Tell by Friedrich hold on, Johann Christoph Friedrich von Schiller. This, of course, has the famous scene where William Tell has to shoot an apple off of his son's head. We saw that image everywhere in Switzerland, like in paintings in the museums, in like more modern advertisements. So it was the perfect timing to read this. It has such great sort of stirring, almost Shakespearean language. Definitely a classic worth checking out. Heidi looked around with growing delight at the mountain peaks she knew so well, and which seemed to greet her like old friends. I'm pretty sure I had read Heidi before in the past, but I reread it this year before I trip, and it's just such a charming children's classic. I think it's so worth it to go back and reread children's classics as an adult, because they're really good ones that still speak to you, and there are always so many little elements of it that you've forgotten, and it's just so fun to revisit. The mountain peaks are definitely characters in Heidi, as are the fir trees, and the wind moving through them, and the goats. There's Turk, and Snowflake, and Daisy, and Duke. Oh, I can't remember the name of the last one. In the little world between the river and mountains, many things can happen that cannot happen anywhere else. If you keep this in mind, you will easily come to know the village priest, Don Camillo, and his adversary, Pepone, the communist mayor. You will not be surprised that Christ watches the goings-on from a big cross in the village church, and not infrequently talks, and that one man beats the other over the head, but fairly, that is, without hatred, and that in the end the two enemies find they agree about essentials. I had read some tales of Don Camillo before, but I hadn't read The Little World of Don Camillo, which I think might technically be the first one. I'm not sure there is particularly an order. I think the other one that I read was Don Camillo and His Flock. They're by Giovanni Giureschi, who is an Italian journalist and writer. They're actually, I believe, really well known in Italy, and there's like an Italian TV series adaptation of Don Camillo. I absolutely love Don Camillo though, and I love his conversations with Christ, because he's always talking to Christ above the altar, the Christ on the cross above the altar, and bringing him his problems. It's just hilarious and charming and heartwarming and makes you think. I ended my first book with the words, "No answer. I know now, Lord, why you utter no answer. You are yourself the answer. Before your face questions die away. What other answer would suffice? Only words, words, to be led out to battle against other words." I read Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis for the first time this year. I found this beautiful copy. Look at how the design stretches all the way around the cover at a library book sale, so it was only, I think, 50 cents. This is one of my cousin's favorite books that had been on my list to read for a long, long time. It's a retelling of the myth of Psyche, but the main character is actually Psyche's sister, Orual. And she is the queen of this kingdom, but she's constantly kind of challenging the gods. And she's always questioning, and there's a lot of sort of strife in her life and in the way she approaches the world. This is just such a beautiful tale, though, of the journey she goes on, kind of without even realizing it, and how her sister Psyche ties into it. Definitely a favorite I'll want to come back and reread. Barely we arrive at you who never depart from us. I reread Confessions by St. Augustine this year. I'd been meaning to reread it. It had been on my list for a while, so I'm so glad I got to it. This is, of course, the story of St. Augustine's conversion to Christianity, and he really goes all the way back to his youngest days and talks about, the different philosophies and rhetoric he learned, like, as a young man. He was not very religious for a long time, but he was always very curious and reading a lot and questioning. I love how he really ties every step of his journey back to Christ and back to God. Christ was there with him every step of the way, and Christ can work through even the smallest things, like little things that seem frivolous can be God speaking to you, and everything for him is an occasion of giving thanks to God. Perhaps the responsibility for repercussions did not belong so much to those who caused them as to those who received them. A speech made in Parliament could, like a stone dropped in water, cause a ripple like a wave in the life of an obscure woman the speaker had never heard of. But she supposed it was she to choose whether the wave should lift or drown her. Elizabeth Goudge is one of my absolute favorite authors. Reading her is just good for the soul. Her characters are so alive. I love the way she talks about their struggles, their faith, and the way she weaves it in it to the setting of the novel. I read The White Witch by Elizabeth Goudge for the first time this year. I'm sure I will be rereading it again in the future, because Elizabeth Goudge is one of those authors you definitely have to reread. This is set at the time of the English Civil War, so Parliament is fighting against King Charles, and the war is really just starting to get going, but this really shows how the war impacts just the ordinary people in the countryside, and you follow characters from all different sides of the conflict, so the royalists and the parliamentarians. You have a family of gypsies that you get to know. I thought from this book I would read you just one other passage because I really liked this. She's talking about an author, William Langland. There are always so many authors in Elizabeth Gooch that I mean to check out. Out of fashion, sighed the old man, like Shakespeare, but God will bring them again to our notice. Praise be to God that all that is of his inspiration is forever safe in his keeping. Perfection is a big word, isn't it? I want to do something that I can offer to God, and you can't offer him anything less than your best. That's a lovely idea, Belle told him. I shall keep it safely and think about it. So I read a number of D.E. Stevenson books earlier this year, and it was hard to pick just one because they were all charming. I don't think I had read the Mrs. Tim books, and I absolutely loved those. But the one I ended up picking was Fletcher's End. This is actually a sequel to the book Belle Lamington. Belle is the main character, so it's so fun that we get to follow her in a second book. Fletcher's End is about Belle setting up her house. It's this beautiful old house that kind of has a character of its own, so it's just so charming to hear Belle learn about the history of the house. I'm sure D.E. Stevenson has featured on my top reads of the year lists in the past. She's just such a charming author who I come back to again and again. The mature Jane Austen could not have pinpointed the weaknesses of Camilla or Mrs. Stanley more sharply than this, and she would have done it in just the same tone of voice, with the same mixture of the cheerful and the merciless. Another author who always ends up sneaking her way into my top reads of the year is the one and only Jane Austen. I actually try not to reread Jane Austen novels too often because I would hate it if they got stale. So of course I like to read other novels about Jane Austen. This is a biography called A Portrait of Jane Austen by David Cecil. I just love the way he writes about her, especially her relationship with her family. I feel like you get a little bit of a different picture of Jane from every biography that you read because we are missing a lot of facts about her life. And so in each biography you get really the interpretation of the author as well as the real Jane. But I think that's really delightful, and I think that's part of the power of Jane Austen and why she's still relevant and still read today. It's because you can come to her in different moods with different mindsets and find something valuable. Up from earth's center, through the seventh gate, I rose, and on the throne of Saturn sate, and many knots unraveled by the road, but not the master knot of human fate. There was the door to which I found no key, there was the veil through which I could not see. Some little talk a while of me and thee there was, and then no more of thee and me. I had never before encountered the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which is translated by Edward Fitzgerald. I think this is the translation that really kind of popularized this work. I feel like you see it quoted and popping up in unexpected places, so it was really fun to read it this year. This was such a cool edition. This is another find. It was $1 at the library book sale. It's so fun to go to a used book sale like without a plan and just really, you know, see what speaks to you, see what pops out. Oh dear, the light is fading fast. I told myself I wasn't going to do the quotation from each book again this year because it takes a long time to find them, and I hadn't sat down before I filmed to write them out. But then at the last minute I was like, oh, but I love having quotations. I feel like that can sometimes be what pulls you into a book or what really gives you a taste of it and makes you say, oh yes, that's something I need to read. So here we are, taking forever to film, trying to remember my favorite quote from a book that I read 7 or 8 months ago. Desert not friendship, renegade with me from raptured realm of Mr. Noroji. I read A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth this year. There were so many casual, like spontaneously composed poems in that book. In fact, one of the families, like that was their favorite thing to do. They loved like making up poems on the spot. There were so many characters in A Suitable Boy. So if you don't like novels where there's a lot going on and a lot of different storylines and characters, then this might not be the one for you. But I thought Vikram Seth did an amazing job of really fully fleshing out all these different characters, all these different families, and then kind of showing all the little subtle threads that bound them all together. Lots of different sides of Indian life, the cities, the countryside, people from all different backgrounds. A plume of sparks, a long coil of dancing fireflies spread across the black ancient shoulder of the crater Menengai, and gradually the vast digesting dark of Africa swallowed up all traces of that audacious grub, the hurrying train. Another book that took me on some global adventures this year was The Flame Trees of Thika by Elspeth Huxley. This book was about some British settlers in Africa in the early 1900s. It's kind of a mix between a memoir and fiction because the author herself did grow up in Africa, but she weaves in a story and some characters, describes the setting so beautifully, so vividly. So you have just a great mix of really interesting descriptions and reflections and story. Seems to me the best a body can do besides his regular job is to plant a little beauty in the world. Last year I had I Married Adventure by Osa Johnson on my list, and this year I have 4 Years in Paradise. This is about just the 4 years that Osa and her husband Martin spent in Kenya at Lake Paradise. They were travel photographers in like the 1920s and 30s, so yeah, this is 1924 to 27. But they brought all of their equipment out to this remote lake where there were tons of animals. They got these beautiful pictures, beautiful movies. I discovered Osa Johnson, of course, from the Animal Kingdom Lodge. Her book, I Married Adventure, is in the Sunset Lounge there. If you follow me, then you will have heard me talk about Osa before and talk about the Martin and Osa Safari Museum, which is located in Chanute, Kansas, where Martin and Osa were from. They actually sent me this book back in April. We did a giveaway for 4 Years in Paradise and I Married Adventure. That was just such a fun memory, fun moment from 2019. So Osa had to be included on the list. I loved I Married Adventure, which is more about the entirety of Martin and Osa's lives adventuring together. But I loved this one too because it really focused in on those 4 years and the challenges and stories. So black was the night, for the electric street lamps were gone out, that it seemed as if an umbrella had stepped impersonally off the car and was conducting her to her home in the teeth of the storm. It's pouring rain and the heroine is trying to get back to her house and she doesn't have an umbrella, but some mysterious person stepped off the streetcar and is escorting her and holding the umbrella over her head. This next book is Crimson Roses by Grace Livingston Hill. It's just a really sweet, charming Christian romance set in like the 30s. The way the roses recur and become a theme is just adorable. The heroine is kind of down on her luck trying to make her way in the city. She ends up getting a job at a department store and that's really fun to hear about. I think she works at like the ribbon counter, but she's also really interested in art and theater, and so she gets like a season ticket to the opera. I won't spoil it, but it's just such an adorable romance. The sky presented a darkening silver blue softened by the evening fall of dust from the shield wall. He stared southward at the escarpment which protected his northern lands from the Coriolis wind, and he wondered why his own peace of mind could find no such shield. I reread Dune this year, and I read for the first time 2 of the sequels of Dune, Dune Messiah and Children of Dune. The original Dune is really, really good, and I would highly recommend. I did, though, also really enjoy Dune Messiah. Children of Dune was just a little too long and wandering for me, but I loved the way Dune Messiah followed up on the story, followed up on the characters, and showed like how things were developing, more political machinations and plots, because in this galaxy it seems like everyone is plotting against each other. This is set in the far, far future, and Paul Atreides is this sort of mythical leader who has these amazing mental powers. When you read Dune, it's so cool the way Frank Herbert has imagined like the far, far distant future and how human beings have really developed their psychological and mental powers. And when I started reading Jung, the psychologist, this is a new anthology of his writings, so different quotations from his books on different themes. And I was thinking as I was reading this, wow, this sounds a lot like Dune. Like it sounds that the way Jung is talking about how we don't know much about our psyche and how to a certain extent it might always kind of elude us because it is this sort of indefinable, intangible thing. And yet we could develop it further. And by developing our understanding of our psyche, we're also really developing our character and kind of getting in touch with primitive man. Like we're getting in touch with like our ancient ancestors whose DNA and some of whose ideas still kind of live in us even though they're buried deep underneath the conscious. And in Dune, the character Aaliyah, you actually see it a little bit more in Children of Dune than you do in Dune Messiah, but she like literally can unlock her past memories and almost like talk with her ancestors, and in fact they can become a little bit dangerous. It turns out it is no coincidence the striking similarities. Frank Herbert read lots of Jung and was really influenced by Jung in writing Dune. I actually just picked up Jung this past month, but it's fun that these two both, I read both of them in the same year. It is worth man's while to take pains with himself, and he has something in his own soul that can grow. It is rewarding to watch patiently the silent happenings in the soul. Dune was not what inspired me to pick up Jung. It was actually kind of two separate inspirations. Jordan Peterson talks about Jung a lot, which makes me wonder if Jordan Peterson has read Dune. I feel like he'd like it. But also the band BTS is inspired by Jung, and again, I wonder. Kim Namjoon is the leader of BTS, and I think kind of the most bookish one. So I wonder if he's read Jordan Peterson or if he's read Dune. I think this anthology has been a fun introduction to Jung. There's divided up into sections on the archetypes, on dreams, on awareness and creative living. Each quotation is really thought-provoking, and I've been trying to mark down my favorite quotations that I find kind of the most interesting so that then I can go and read the full book, the full work that it was pulled from. On the back of this edition, they have a picture of Jung's house, which it turns out, it says it's near the village of Bollingen at the far end of Lake Zurich. And of course, we went to Switzerland this year, and we actually took a boat cruise around Lake Zurich. So I went back and was looking at my footage and was like kind of scanning the shores because I was filming the shores. It was absolutely beautiful, stunning scenery, because I think we passed right by Jung's house without even knowing it. The Word of God is living and effective, sharper than any two-edged sword, penetrating even between soul and spirit, joints and marrow, and able to discern reflections and thoughts of the heart. We've made it to read number 19 of 2019, and I thought I would give this spot on the list to Magnificat. This is actually a prayer journal, so I've had one for every month. I subscribed starting in July. My mom and my grandmother actually had subscribed to Magnificat, so I'd seen these books kicking around our house and had read some of them before. I'm always meaning to read the Bible more, but sometimes it's difficult to know where to begin. I love having these daily mass readings, and there's prayers for the morning and prayers for the evening. It's just great to have a concrete reminder to work more prayer and Bible reading into your daily routine. Well, that's about it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed this year's top reads of 2019. I do have a whole playlist of all my bookish and reading vlogs if you'd like to check them out. I'd love to hear about your favorite reads from 2019 down in the comments. Also, if you haven't caught it, I did do a 20 classics I hope to read in the 2020s. Thank you all so much for watching and following along and commenting and being part of the Bookish Kingdom this year. I hope you have a wonderful new year and a great start to 2020. I'll talk to you all again soon, and until then, stay bookish. Bye, guys!